World Seagrass Day. And firstly, really want to thank a lot of scientists, conservationists, and politicians in Sri Lanka who were a major part in pushing forward this concept of having a World Seagrass Day. And alongside that, there was a lot of international scientists who helped support that case to get it in front of the UN Assembly and actually have it ratified. And here we are with that end result. And hopefully, by having this, we can further push forward seagrass conservation around the world, which is fantastic for all our collective wish to have a better world. So today's event, just to give you a brief summary, we'll have a couple of brief hellos initially. I'll give you some sort of info about the day, and then we'll run into a series of presentations by our panelists that have been pre-recorded. Following that, we'll then have a question and answer sort of discussion session with the panelists around these challenges for seagrass conservation. And those questions posed to the panelists hopefully will come from the floor, will come from you as attendees. And we have a question and answer box that hopefully you as attendees can all see, and that enables you to pose questions, and some of those might be answered immediately because they're a short answer question by the panel as the talks are ongoing. But hopefully some of those questions will then be posed to the panelists at the end, and we'll have a discussion around those key questions. For those of you whose questions are posed and don't actually get answered today, we will actually endeavour to answer all of them, probably using social media. So don't feel left out if you pose a question and it hasn't been answered today. We will ensure that we get to them. So please, by all means, add your questions. So just to say thank you to our 6 panelists who are attending today. Firstly, we've got Carmen de los Santos from the Centre for Marine Sciences in Algarve. Then we've got Len McKenzie from James Cook University and Seagrass Watch. Gary Kendrick from the University of Western Australia Oceans Institute. We've got Jillian Ooi from the University of Malaysia. We've got Maricela de la Torre Castro from Stockholm University. And last but not least, we've got Jesse Jarvis from the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, who are all giving a presentation. So thank you all for putting those presentations together. Great to have your collective expertise from many different parts of the world, different scientific backgrounds. So hopefully that'll come together to give a nice overview of the challenges of seagrass conservation. So the reason we're doing this webinar on World Seagrass Day is that a number of years ago, a few of us got together and wrote a paper called Global Challenges for Seagrass Conservation. Many people may not have always agreed with everything that was written in that paper, and also that the times have possibly moved on and changed and adapted since. So by realizing that paper did actually create a lot of interest, and but there's things have moved on, we've actually asked our 6 panelists to give a presentation on some of their sort of their views, their hopes, their personal experiences around those key topics in sort of 6 minutes to 9 minute presentations each. So they'll run for about, I think, for 52 minutes. Unfortunately, Len had some logistical problems at the last minute, so was unable to complete his presentation. So please forgive my very rapid impromptu presentation that I squeezed in as a challenge 2 on his behalf. I think all the other presentations had a lot more preparation and a bit nice to the ear to listen to. So forgive my last minute nature there, and apologies for those problems that Len experienced. So before we start, we're also really honoured today to have Leticia Carvalho, who is the principal scientist for marine and fresh water within the United Nations Environment Programme. And given this is the first United Nations World Seagrass Day, I thought it was fitting for her to join us and just say a few words of introduction to World Seagrass Day and convey her excitement for where we're at. So over to Leticia to welcome today.
Thank you very much, Richard. I hope you hear me well, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be here with you to kick off this very important day. So indeed, I am Leticia Carvalho, head of UNEP's Marine and Freshwater work. And I'm very glad for you inviting me to provide these opening remarks, celebrating the first anniversary of the World Seagrass Day. So this was declared, this amazing opportunity and day was declared by the United Nations General Assembly last year, following a resolution passed by Sri Lanka, as you mentioned, Richard, and supporting countries to emphasize the conservation and seagrass, in marine environments. So one must applaud these countries for their leadership in elevating this unsung hero of life below water. And the supporters as well deserve the kudos for bringing us to this opportunity. So let me go into the UNEP's production of science, or actually, the UNEP's evidence or joining evidence efforts, let's see, to elevate this topic. And by 2020, UNEP launched the publication, Out of the Blue, the Value of Seagrasses to the Environment and to the People. And this publication states that 7% of the seagrass habitat is being lost worldwide per year. This is equivalent to a football field every 30 minutes. And this is happening due to unsustainable and irresponsible human activity. And this matters a lot because seagrasses are one of the most valuable marine ecosystems on Earth. It's covering around 300,000 square kilometers in 159 countries in 6 continents. So from the tropics to the Arctic Circle, I'm sure that a number of scientists are covering all of this helm of areas in different continents and speaking today. So, but it's very important also to mention that the carbon sequestration potential of the seagrass is just enormous. And only recently we start to understand about this. So seagrass accounts for 10% of the ocean's capacity to store carbon and can capture carbon from the atmosphere up to 35 times faster than tropical rainforests. So we are just starting to dig into the value of these ecosystems, not really well known in a wider perspective. So their vital functions also include its role in stabilizing the sea bottom and providing food and shelter for commercial and recreational fish species. They provide nurseries to 20% of the world's largest fisheries. So 1 billion people live within 100 kilometers of seagrass meadows. So they just live close by. They are absolutely dependent and with their livelihoods of these ecosystems. sometimes without knowing. And 20% of the world's largest fisheries depend on these ecosystems as well. So we also know that emissions from loss of seagrasses are estimated to contribute up to 299 kg carbon to the atmosphere per year. So saving seagrass is a matter of survival for charismatic species such as turtles, manatees, and dugongs. So what we have at stake here is if seagrasses perish, so too will this animal of mermaid legends. So the message is clear: healthy seagrasses provide a source of opportunity to mitigate climate change, to adapt it to the future changes, to build resilience, and to offer a vast societal benefits. We need to act absolutely now to protect seagrasses by prioritizing timely, ambitious, and coordinated actions in the areas of conservation, management, sustainable management, restoration, and we need to do this aligned with the Global Biodiversity Framework just approved last year. We need to also ensure that the local communities who have been living in harmony with nature, with these ecosystems for thousands of years, will benefit of the conservation and 100% of well management of these areas. So today, let's shine a light on the magic of the seagrass meadows and the species that are inhabiting this magical ecosystems. Let's shine a light on the need and dependence of human and non-human alike of these ecosystems. I really would like to wish you great discussions in the course of this panel. Thank you very much for inviting UNEP for this kickoff. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Letitia, for that welcome. Yes, it's a nice moment certainly to shine light on seagrasses. So without further ado, I will commence the presentations, starting with Carmen Santos from the Algarve. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Carmen. I'm a seagrass researcher based in South Portugal, and I will talk on challenge number 1, which is achieving social recognition of seagrass importance. Before starting, I would like to thank Project Seagrass for the invitation to be part of this panel today. The lack of recognition of seagrasses was first acknowledged in the research community by Carlos Duarte and colleagues 15 years ago. And in their article, they compared the number of scientific publications and media reports on 4 types of coastal ecosystems: seagrasses, salt marshes, mangroves, and coral reefs. The results showed that coral reef receive a disproportionate attention when compared to the other ecosystems, but especially when compared to seagrasses. One of the justifications for this result was that seagrasses were not seen as charismatic as coral reefs. Since the publication of that paper, there has been an improvement in the publication effort and in the media attention that seagrasses receive, but other recent similar studies demonstrated that seagrasses are still far behind coral reefs and mangroves. From this and other works, as well as the shared experience of global seagrass research community, it is clear that social recognition of seagrasses is still limited. And this is a problem because seagrasses are important coastal ecosystems for the many services they provide, and because they have been lost historically along all coasts over the world and remain still threatened in many places. We refer to social recognition of seagrasses when the society gives value and understands how seagrass ecosystems contribute to human well-being and to the health of the planet. And only when that society is aware of the importance of seagrasses, they will take care about them. The most important aspect of social recognition is that it can result in a change of people's behavior in response to environmental concerns. And this is needed to achieve a sustainable use of coastal ecosystem in the future. Why? Well, because when there is a high level of recognition, people will take well-informed decisions that will lead to reverse seagrass losses and enhance the benefits they provide. On the opposite scenario, when there is a low level of social recognition, people will make ill-informed decisions that will lead to seagrass degradation and loss. Thus, a major challenge is to develop strategies to improve global societal recognition of seagrasses through their understanding and creating attitudes and behaviors towards the importance of protecting them. In their article, Global Challenges for Seagrass Conservation, Richard Unsworth and colleagues identified 3 actions to improve social recognition of seagrasses. The first is to increase experiential learning opportunities, and this is essential because learning is the primary process by which we navigate through life, and it is how we make decisions and we solve problems. But why experiential learning? Well, this is a way of learning in which people experience something for themselves and then reflect and think about what they have learned. And this way of learning leads people to act and make informed decisions. And as I mentioned earlier, we need to invest in people making better decisions. However, human population growth, the urbanization and the socioeconomic disparity threaten people's opportunity to engage and connect directly with nature, including seagrasses. So educators, researchers, and other stakeholders interested or involved in raising awareness of seagrass ecosystem should opt for activities that promote human-nature interactions because these are very poor nowadays in most of the societies. The second recommendation of the authors of the article is to bring together research and expertise from other fields of study, because seeking social recognition through the natural sciences alone may not be effective. They propose integrating social sciences such as psychology, sociology, and communication sciences to overcome some of the barriers in the lack of awareness of seagrasses. Personally, I believe that other disciplines that could be used to improve the social recognition of seagrasses are the arts, because they have the power to connect deeply with emotions. And I strongly believe that in order to raise awareness of seagrasses, we need to create emotional bonds between people and nature. The last recommendation is to develop partnerships with the global media. And this includes the 3 main categories, which are news media, web media, and of course social media. And these are complementary tools that creates opportunities and provides a diverse range of channels of communication with different audiences to communicate about seagrasses, their benefits, and their conservation issues. Now, I would like to highlight 2 recent milestones that have or will have a positive impact in our goal of increasing social recognition. The first one is the publication of the Global Synthesis Report Out of the Blue, which was released in 2020 by the United Nations Environment Programme, together with Grid Arendal and UNEP's World Conservation Monitoring Center. And this document is a milestone because it's the first of its kind to provide a call to action to managers and decision makers to protect seagrasses. The second is what we are celebrating today in this event, and is the declaration of the World Seagrass Day, which was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly last year based on a resolution that was sponsored by the government of Sri Lanka. Personally, I think that these 2 achievements, as well as many others in the history of social or scientific recognition of seagrasses, are due to the fact that behind them are enthusiastic and dedicated people and teams that work for what they believe in. Before finishing, I would like to share what we are doing in South Portugal to raise awareness on seagrass meadows at the local and national levels. We combine different approaches. In the formal education category, we train K-12 teachers on seagrass biology, ecology, and ecosystem services so they can apply this knowledge in their classroom. We also organize outreach activities such as exhibitions in science museums and kayak tours to raise awareness by informal education. We have a continuous dialogue with the governmental institutions that are responsible of nature conservation and the environment in Portugal. And this is to make sure that seagrasses are recognized in the national policies and in management actions. We create press releases, media content, and we give interviews to disseminate our research and educational activities in the media. And finally, we have recently been in contact with visual artists in the framework of partnerships created by Project Seagrass and a private company to raise awareness on seagrasses. I would like you to take 3 messages from this presentation. The first one is that we still need to invest in social recognition of seagrasses because despite the advances done in the last decade, it is still limited. And we can do this by creating learning opportunities, by adopting interdisciplinary approaches and collaborating with global media. And we also need dedicated and enthusiastic people that work on what they believe in, and this is to reach new milestones that we have done in the last years. Thank you very much for your attention.
One of the biggest challenges of seagrass conservation around the world is knowing where it is and what condition it's in, so actually appropriate action can be taken to conserve it. The image here in the background is of myself and my team out in a bitterly cold April snorkel in North Wales. I think it'd been sleeting that day. We were freezing, but the reason we were in the water was to actually try and get some basic information on the presence of a seagrass meadow that had once been recorded in Abersoch over 100 years ago. And we had some information that it might still be there, so we went out. And it sort of highlights the challenges really of getting data about where seagrass is, whether it's actually there or not, and what condition it's actually in. Because sometimes that includes lots of fancy remote satellites, but sometimes it's about getting wet, cold, and just getting in there and finding out something about that seagrass. This slide exemplifies the need to map and to monitor seagrass. These 4 points on Seagrass Spotter are one of the few bits of data that remains from a 5-hectare seagrass meadow that was mapped for the first time, fortunately, in 2014 by myself and a couple of students, and which actually disappeared not long after that and has never recovered. Unfortunately, it had never been monitored, and there was no long-term data to understand what the cause of this loss was. But in many parts of the world, we're not fortunate to have these records of loss, and therefore not be able to make a case for trying to bring back seagrass or to try and improve conditions that improve the likelihood of recovery or perhaps restoration. It's not just mapping of seagrass that's important. It is also the long-term monitoring, to be able to make interventions early on, to understand what are driving populations and trying to ultimately take measures that ensure the long-term resilience of a particular habitat. Here is a figure of density of seagrass from up in Lindisfarne on the northeast coast of England. And here you can see that over a 10-year period, the seagrass has gone up, it's gone down, it's gone back up again, it's crashed completely, and then it's recovered again. And from a management perspective, the first concern in 2017 would be there's very little seagrass, and is there some sort of anthropogenic factor influencing that seagrass? And actually, there could well be some interactions, But what we found from actually looking at this data and trying to understand it relative to local climate variability was actually some of the wintertime temperatures and freshwater pulses are actually some of the biggest impacts on that. And you think, well, why the wintertime? But this is an intertidal population of seagrass where the population is commonly annual, so seed setting and germination is pretty important. So therefore, those triggers in the wintertime to actually influence germination are probably quite critical. And therefore, some of these dips and troughs are probably not of huge concern. We just need to ensure that seed production is maintained as being high, and that we're mindful of the wintertime conditions. But ultimately, it's only by being able to look at the long-term trends can we begin to understand what is driving those populations and make interventions that are appropriate to that local population. But what can we do to help map and to monitor the world seagrass? Governments are not going to take the necessary action to do this. We know that. It's too big a cost, and the political will is not there. Communities have to do it themselves. Whether that communities is based on individuals walking along a beach, finding some seagrass, going for a little snorkel, taking a picture. Whether it's actually a community in a village realizing that they've got some seagrass on their doorstep and they want to understand more about it and they want to map it. There are plenty of community citizen science tools out there that can help contribute to understanding the world seagrass. Beyond that, there's other communities that are really interested in seagrass, and I find this great picture up here on the top right, which is from a fishing website telling people how to find seagrass on Google Earth. We need to bring that information together into our sort of collective understanding. But importantly, there are companies, enterprises out there who are trying to do their bit for the environment and also make a contribution to this sphere. We've got major remote sensing projects happening around the world. In the UK, we've got an organisation doing it. Globally, there's some groups working on it, and we've also partnering Project Seagrass with a group building an armada of remote vessels that we're using to acoustically map the seabed. So there are a lot of good tools out there, but the reality is that none of them are perfect. They all have their challenges. It's a bit easier sometimes looking at a clear water in the Mediterranean and mapping with a satellite there relative to a turbid, algae-filled bay in North Wales. So the challenges exist at every level, and we need to pool resources. We need to be able to use the citizen science approach at the same time as being able to use the technological approach. And ultimately, that brings me to my final slide, which is that there is no solution to mapping seagrass. It's about bringing all the different collective responses and abilities and skills and tools together to actually map the world seagrass. Thank you.
Hello there, everyone. I've been asked to give my perspectives about Challenge 3, which is identifying threatening activities at local scales to target management actions accordingly. But first, I'd like to start by acknowledging the local coastal communities of Johor as the primary stakeholders and custodians of the seagrass ecosystems we work in. Their local expert knowledge has enriched and paved the way for my work and that of my fellow researchers, and I hope that we may continue to learn from them. Seagrass meadows face quite a variety of threats, and if we look to expert opinion about what those top threats might be, as Elena Grach and co-authors did in their paper in 2012, here are the 4 top threats to seagrass across the world: agricultural runoff, urban or industrial runoff, urban or port infrastructure development, and dredging. And zooming in to Southeast Asia, Sudo and co-authors in 2021 found that meadows here are declining at an annual average rate of around 5%. They used the literature survey approach and identified very similar threats to seagrass, which were coastal development, aquaculture, destructive fishing, and water quality. But they used very different terms for those threats. For instance, coastal development would have been categorized as urban or port infrastructure development in Elena's paper, and also water quality in Sudo's paper matches with the category of agricultural runoff up here. I think the issue of differing terminologies for threats might be an interesting point to pick up later in this discussion. If we look at the breakdown for each country shown in these columns here, there's the Ryukyu Island of Japan, southern mainland China, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam with the total at the end here, we'll see that the body of knowledge about threats to seagrass decline in Southeast Asia is rather patchy. Most of the papers came from Thailand and Vietnam. And there was just one paper coming out of the Philippines, which is surprising because the Philippines is a significant seagrass biodiversity hotspot. There was none from Indonesia, which has the longest coastline in Southeast Asia. To conclude, Southeast Asia loses 5% of its seagrass meadows every year, but the body of published scientific knowledge about the causes of seagrass decline is patchy, and we have critical gaps for areas in Southeast Asia that are seagrass hotspots. The question is, what can we do to build up this body of knowledge about threats? The seagrass community agrees on the value of local ecological knowledge in identifying local threats. LEK are understandings, beliefs, and practices that human societies have developed in relation to their local ecosystems. And because LEK comes from long-term direct observations of an ecosystem by people who live in an area, it can be incredibly valuable for identifying threats to seagrass ecosystems that might otherwise go unnoticed. For instance, seasonal threats may not be immediately apparent to a visiting scientist. But there are challenges associated with using LEK, and I'd like to point out 3 of these in the rest of this presentation. There are a few nice examples of LEK being used to identify threatening activities to seagrass from around the world, but here's an example of how LEK helped us in our work at the Johor River estuary in Malaysia. The intertidal seagrass meadow here used to be extensive and of very high coverage. But in 2022, when we tried to relocate these meadows to do seagrass monitoring, we found that they were either gone or were dominated more by pioneer species with low diversity, and they were very different from their original condition. So we asked those in the communities who had direct experience of the seagrass decline about what they thought the causes of seagrass decline might have been. Most of them said dirty water, which came from either industrial runoff or from port infrastructure development. In one village, hot water effluent from a palm oil mill was said to be the cause of meadow decline. And once that mill shut down a few years ago, the meadow slowly recovered. And this explains why it's dominated more by halophila now. Also, sea filling or land reclamation in the vicinity of one meadow was said to have narrowed the river mouth and caused hydrodynamic changes that impacted the meadow. So overall, we found the community members to be very tuned into environmental changes, and their insights helped us put together a funding plan to monitor those specific anthropogenic activities. So in this instance, in an intertidal meadow with visibly obvious threats such as port construction and sea filling, LEK provided a great foundation for our science work, but this isn't always the case. Using LEK for subtidal meadows in waters that are optically complex has been much more challenging because these are not so easy for local communities to keep track of. And this video here is to show what it looks like in terms of visibility in some of the subtidal meadows that we study. This particular meadow went through a dieback period in 2016 to 2017, but that dieback wasn't fully evident to the local communities. However, when we told them the meadow had declined, they could very quickly pinpoint certain environmental changes. Some suggested stronger storms that had caused erosion. Some pointed out that there had been more dugongs grazing in the area. So there are still ways to utilize LEK for meadows that are less accessible, but it's not as straightforward as for intertidal meadows, and we have to keep that in mind. But here's the bad news. We are encouraging seagrass researchers to leverage on LEK to identify threats, but LEK itself is dynamic and is, unfortunately, on a downward trend, as shown by Shankar Aswani and co-authors in this paper in 2018. This diagram shows the temporal distribution of all papers about LEK trends, which were either shown to be losses or persistence or as being ambiguous. And the blue bars here show that there were more LEK losses between 1992 and 2015. LEK losses or erosion can happen because of globalization and modernization. And in some cases, here, it can happen because of top-down approaches to conservation. But I won't go into that right now. We can always pick it up in the discussion session. The main message here is that if LEK is eroded, will that desensitize the community to environmental loss, including seagrass loss? In the course of interacting with local communities to identify threats to seagrass, there were some unexpected issues that emerged about the relationships between researchers and the communities they work with. Community members gave accounts of how researchers would enter a community to collect information or samples from them, but without giving due credit to the community, and that was something they took to heart. They perceived researchers as seeing them, the community, as resources, and that their LEK is there for us to harvest or extract, but they would much rather be seen as equal partners. My takeaway from this is that we should acknowledge the value of working in multidisciplinary teams, which should include social scientists who are tuned in to the ethics and best practices of working with human societies. To summarize, LEK may be more useful for visible impacts and threats, and that might mean subtidal seagrass in waters that are optically complex may not enjoy the same benefits from LEK as do intertidal meadows. The global base of LEK is eroding, and we should be concerned because this means we may lose a source of information when trying to identify threats that only local communities can do. So what should we be doing about this? And finally, if we want to use LEK to identify threatening activities to seagrass, we can't just regard the community as a resource. We also need to engage with them in a respectful and mindful way by giving them due credit in our work and acknowledging them as partners and local experts. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to comment on the challenge number 4 in global seagrass conservation. And that is using the social ecological system to balance the needs of the people and the planet. And what I'm going to do today is to comment on 3 key points that we need to work further when we are talking about the social ecological system and the whole challenge. The social ecological system has brought huge advances, but I think that there is a scope and space to more of this. So regarding this challenge, I want to bring to your attention 3 key points. Point number 1, strong managers. Point number 2, inclusive management. And point number 3, what needs? When we talk about the balance between people and planet, we should ask more deeply what kind of needs are we talking about. And point number 1 and point number 2 are very straightforward and can be actually implemented right away. Point number 3 is a more long-term challenge. So point number 1 of strong managers. Social ecological systems concept is a relatively new concept. It has no more than 30 years on the scientific community, and we know that it takes quite a long time for science to seep down and gain other domains. And specifically when we talk about real managers and real management done at the ground. We know also that this type of management is more complex than conventional management, for example, top-down approaches. So we need really to invest in capacity building for managers. And what I mean with managers here is those managers working with the system on a daily basis, those managers that are normally hired at governmental agencies. It can be others, but those in the governmental agencies have normally the budget and the authority to be able to do policy, legislation, to take samples, and to monitor. Now, the second point of inclusion and inclusive management refers to focusing and integrating all the people that actually is working with the system, interacting with the system, taking benefits from the system. We tend to focus on fishermen, but actually we have women, we have children, we have elders that are interacting and being with seagrasses in an everyday basis also. If we do this, we will increase participation, we will increase justice and equity, and we will contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that a very important point here is that to include the people and the actors that are relevant to the system, it will provide a better and more realistic representation of the whole system. And this in turn will make possible to do better science, better management, and better governance. Now, we are in point number 3 of what needs. This is the more complex one, and this is the one that needs more a longer time frame to be developed. So this is because the use of this social ecological system approach has philosophical implications. We have to ask ourselves, what are our philosophical bases to use this? Do we have an instrumental view in which we only expect the seagrasses to provide goods and services to humans? Or do we have a deep ecological view in which seagrasses have own value, own right to exist, and a deep intrinsic value? These two extremes are important, and we have to ask, where are we in this? When it comes to philosophy of science, it has also very deep implications in terms of ontological and epistemological issues. The social ecological system used to be portrayed as two circles. In one, we have nature, and in the other, we have society. But actually, the idea of the concept is that we have only one integrated system, and we have to develop further how do we deal with this single system that is not two circles anymore. Then the next point is that in a way, it's relatively easy to see what are the needs of seagrasses. They need clean water, they need nutrients, they need light, they need stable sediments, they need to be left alone, etc. But when it comes to the needs of the humans, this is not very easy to determine. And I think that sometimes we tend to oversimplify and say that the needs of the humans is high quality protein. But I think that we have to make more research to embrace the whole set of human needs. So to recapitulate, point number one of strong managers, we need managers that have good knowledge of what is the social ecological system, and we need to target managers that are in real and daily contact with the system. Point number two, we need to take seriously the issue of inclusive management to get a better representation of the system. This is good for science, this is good for management, and this is good for governance. And point number three, we should be aware of the philosophical and scientific implications of working with this type of framework. And we need to think more about this, and we need to develop it even more. And finally, thank you so much. This is a great achievement, and I think that we should have a party after this wonderful seminar. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Gary Kendrick, and I'm here today to talk about Challenge 5, generating scientific research to support conservation actions. Seagrass has evolved over the last 100 million years, and 100 million years ago the world was a very different place. There was a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere and in the seawater, and the temperatures are much warmer, so the average sea temperatures were around 22 degrees Celsius. On top of that, they've evolved in a time of changing steric height of the sea or sea level, sometimes quite dramatically, plus or minus 150 meters. But that doesn't mean they're not under threat through anthropogenic activities. And this talk is about research for conservation of seagrasses, and I've chosen 4 major areas to focus on. I don't have a lot of time. One is maintaining resilience in coastal systems, looking at timescales of loss and recovery, synergistic and additive impacts, and assisted recovery through restoration. Also understanding the connectivity across habitats and ecosystems. This includes things like looking at the atmospheric land, river, coast, mangrove, seagrass, coral reef, open ocean, global ecosystem, to look at everything in a holistic way. Trophic connectivity, the behavioural seascape. The third one is understanding the historical and deep ecology of contemporary seagrasses. And this is because seagrasses have evolved to live in salty, highlight, wetted sediment, estuarine and coastal environments. And I'll talk a little bit about the microbial landscape. I'll finish with talking about societal perceptions and talk a little bit about Indigenous ecological knowledge and community enrolment and participation. Number 1, maintaining resilience. I'd like to use a personal story here, one that affected the whole of the West Australian coastline in 2011. It was an extreme marine heat wave, and in Shark Bay we lost 1,000 of the 4,300 square kilometres of seagrasses post the extreme heat wave. The response was whole of community. The scientific response was to really collate and look at what the impact was and how much recovery occurred post the heat wave. And these are just some documents. So one I'd like to point to, of course, is the application of the Climate Vulnerability Index to Shark Bay. This is looking into the future. It looks like Shark Bay is warming, both in the air and the water, and it's going to become an extreme environment for all organisms, including humans, to live in. Well, what's really come out of this is we've just released the Swansea Shark Bay Science Plan, which will inject about $20 million into climate-related research in the seagrass-dominated ecosystem. Number 2, understanding ecosystem connectivity. Here I fall back on a paper that I was involved in, with Kate O'Brien led, and really put together a great story about looking at everything across scales, looking at from the seconds and minutes to hours, days, weeks, months, years, and into centuries, and looking at the scales of millimeters to tens of thousands of kilometers in relation to how you manage for conservation persistence of seagrasses. We applied some of these ideas to the changes in trophic structure in Shark Bay after the loss of 1,000 square kilometres of seagrass. That loss resulted in that bottom-up effect, resulted in changes in the scallop and crab fishery, which declined dramatically in the system. Sea snakes and cormorants and green turtles and dugongs and dolphins declined in the system and stayed low in numbers over the recorded studies. Number 3, understanding historical deep ecology of seagrasses. With the explosion of genomic methodologies these days, we've been able to really hone in on our understanding of the source and of present distributions of species, and to look at connectivity in a very serious way and to understand the importance of connectivity in conservation. We've also been able to look at the deep evolution of the genomes of seagrasses through whole genome methodologies just recently, and what they're pointing towards is that seagrasses are a polyphyletic group where individual families have followed different routes for evolution into the salty environment they live in. I mentioned the seagrass holobiont, and this has been a personal journey for me in my understanding of the importance of sulphur in marine coastal ecosystems, and especially in sediments, and the effect of sulphur on the health of seagrasses. I've been very lucky to work with Schultz and Martin and Fraser over the years. Schultz and Martin describe these wonderful things called cable bacteria, which are basically just proton pumps or batteries that keep oxygenation occurring where the young roots are growing, but it's really at the rhizoplane. It's not the whole sediment, the bulk sediment. Whereas Fraser's taken a much bigger view. He's looked at bulk sediment as well as the rhizosphere and found strong microbial sulfur genes associated with sulfide intrusion into seagrasses. So there seems to be some sort of synergy going on between the sulfur oxidization and increase in sulfur effects on seagrasses. Martin has also done some really nice work looking at the functional core functions associated with microbiomes. And again, sulfur cyclers turn out to be very, very important. Gamma proteobacteria, delta proteobacteria, etc. And I think this sort of groundbreaking work leads us to a greater understanding of the seagrass as a community with all of its microbes associated with it. We need to influence society and get society involved, get communities involved with the conservation of seagrasses. And one of the greatest sources of information about deep ecology and the relationship of the coast and sea country and land country and the changes that have occurred over the last 45,000 years in Australia have been Indigenous Australian Aborigines. And I'd just like to give you two sort of quick examples here. One, the Bardi Jawi in the Dampier Archipelago in northern Kimberley have looked at their traditional ecological knowledge and wondered how they could maintain the existing knowledge using a monitoring program based on scientific ecological knowledge. And this combination of science and Indigenous knowledge really works well for an ecologist. I highly recommend getting involved with Indigenous communities. And on that note, the Mulgana from Shark Bay are heavily involved with me actively involved with me in seagrass restoration at the scales of hectares in the present time. We are all involved in seagrass restoration at some level, or conservation of seagrasses, but I'd just like to point out two projects I've been involved in. One, the Operation Posidonia from New South Wales in Australia, which is really trying to look after meadows that are highly threatened through restoration. And then a more recent program I've been involved in is Seeds for Snapper. And Seeds for Snapper is about planting Posidonia seeds to make habitat for juvenile snapper. And the other way we communicate is through stories. I think we've got to move away from that passive form of communication and get much, much more active to be really effective in conserving seagrasses. My area I'm supposed to be talking about, theme 5, is science for conservation. And the Seeds to Snapper program is a classic one where we've been able to take 12 years of learning in how to do seed-based restoration and turn it into a program that has over 750 active participants in 2022 in West Australia. Rather than finishing with a list, I always like going back to looking at the world as a social ecological system. I really can't remember where I got this figure from, but I love this figure. It's about the society our adaptive capacity for maintaining resilience with ourselves and our natural environment around us. And it's the will and intent we put towards that, and the ability to accept change and modify our behaviours, and in our proaction and bold decision making in that area. And today I've just talked about the knowledge to inform the decision making. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Jessie Jarvis, and I am excited to talk to you on World Seagrass Day about seagrass conservation and action in an era of climate change. Threats to seagrass ecosystems occur at local, regional, and global levels. Examples of local threats to seagrasses include direct competition with aquaculture for bottom area, or even impacts of fishing gear on seagrass meadow area, including things like prop scars. Regional impacts include agricultural runoff and runoff from urban infrastructure, which can negatively impact water clarity and therefore affect seagrass growth and survival. At a global scale, one of the bigger impacts are those from climate change, and those include temperature increases, which can result in habitat loss through heat stress, altered rainfall patterns, which can either increase or decrease salinity, causing again more osmotic stress for seagrasses, and then even sea level rise. So as sea levels rise, it can result in loss of habitat if the shoreline has been hardened and the seagrasses can't expand inward. The deep edge of the meadow can actually be negatively affected by not having enough light. Impacts of climate change on seagrass habitats are already being observed globally. Here's an example of the after effects of a marine heat wave in Shark Bay in Australia. Prior to the heat wave, there were very lush Posidonia meadows, including those seen in figures A and B on the top. And then following the marine heat wave event, there was also a significant loss of seagrass area and cover throughout the system. And we're seeing examples of negative impacts of climate change in areas all over the globe, including the Mediterranean and throughout parts of the United States. The good news is, despite the overall predicted continued impacts of climate change to occur in seagrass meadows in the next 50 to 100 years, and those which will ultimately reduce the resilience, ecosystem services, and global coverage of seagrasses, because seagrasses respond relatively well to conservation efforts, and we have made some strides when it comes to restoration of seagrass habitats, even under very stressful conditions, the benefit of conservation remains the same even into the future, and may actually have a bigger overall impact in protecting and conserving seagrasses than other important coastal ecosystems, including coral reefs. When it comes to seagrass conservation under a changing climate, there are four main areas that we need to consider. The first is, where are seagrasses now, and where do we expect them to be distributed in the future? This is a global map of seagrass distribution broken up into different bioregions based on temperatures and species. So we divide these regions into places like temperate areas, tropical, and Mediterranean areas. And this is where we have the green dots are known areas of seagrass observations. And we know that this is where they are located now. However, under a changing climate, species distributions have already begun to shift as both temperate and tropical species begin to move poleward. As such, these different observations where their seagrasses are located currently may not be where they are in the future, and conservation efforts need to consider what happens when seagrasses move. How do they interact with species that are currently in areas where they expand to? How does that affect ecosystem function? And then how does that affect our overall conservation efforts and our success in conservation? In addition to better understanding seagrass distribution under a warming climate, it's also important for us to get additional early warning indicators for when conservation efforts are needed or if they're working. So currently, a lot of our seagrass monitoring efforts rely very heavily on structural and demographic indicators, including seagrass area, density, percent cover. However, it can take several months of environmental stress before we see any change in these structural indicators. And therefore, when we do start to first see an indication that there's something is stressing the seagrass meadows, it typically happens right before or during or even after a large degradation event, so a large loss of seagrass. And that is the same for both small and large types of seagrass species. However, if we could also add to our monitoring programs some additional physiological and biochemical indicators which respond to stress in the order of magnitude of weeks rather than months, we could pick up those degradation events a little earlier, and that would allow us a greater chance to enforce some conservation efforts and help increase resilience of seagrass meadows prior to the environmental stress resulting in large-scale declines. We may also need to rethink our conservation targets themselves. A lot of regions globally have its seagrass conservation targets based on previous distribution of seagrasses throughout the system and also their water quality conditions that allow them to grow and survive. Many of these light requirements, however, are expected to change as climate continues to warm. As you have an increase in overall water temperatures, that is going to increase the amount of light that plants need to survive and will therefore decrease the amount of depth where they can actually survive and reduce the amount of area where seagrasses may actually be able to survive in these regions. And therefore, we need to rethink not only our conservation targets based on what conditions were like when they were originally established, but what they will actually potentially be like in the future. In addition, when we're establishing our conservation targets, we need to consider the cumulative impacts of stress that occur across molecular, physiological, and morphological levels, and how that may actually impact the ability of seagrasses to respond to additional stressors. And we need to consider how climate change will affect the feedback loops that already exist within seagrass meadows. For example, if there's a decline in seagrass area due to a marine heat wave, how will that affect the previous positive feedback loop where there's a lot of seagrass cover would reduce the amount of sediment in the water column and increase water clarity? If that feedback loop is lost, how does that affect the ability of seagrasses in those areas to respond to climate change? So both cumulative impacts and feedback loops need to be considered when it comes to establishing conservation targets. In addition, innovative restoration techniques are needed. For example, moving beyond collecting seeds and using them in the same area to potentially establishing seagrass nurseries where we can maintain and grow propagules that are potentially more resilient to stress in different areas. And we're seeing some of these nurseries already beginning to develop in places like Florida, and the United States, in Australia, and in the UK. Following the footsteps of terrestrial conservation efforts, in particular those of forestry management, there's been discussion lately of potentially using assisted migration to help with seagrass conservation. In particular, the idea of seed migration, where seed sources are moved climatically or geographically within their current ranges to help increase the resilience and help maintain genetic diversity of the species throughout its range from areas that are currently being impacted by climate change to those that will be impacted to a greater extent in the future. So in summary, seagrass conservation action in an era of climate change should consider how to incorporate projected future distributions of seagrasses into habitat conservation efforts, should use indicators that provide an early warning of seagrass climate change impacts, could also use future climate-adjusted conservation targets that allow for both consideration of cumulative impacts and ecological feedbacks and how climate change affects those feedbacks. And finally, continue to develop and innovate restoration techniques to build resiliency into our seagrass habitats. With that, I'd like to say thank you, and I look forward to our discussion. Happy World Seagrass Day.
Thank you very much for those wonderful talks. It was really interesting to hear the different perspectives from coming all around the world, really, on seagrass conservation. And I think it was just wonderful to see some common themes following through all those presentations. In particular, it's nice to see just a broader recognition of the social ecological system value of seagrasses, that solving conservation challenges is about people, not just about plants, and that sort of seems to weave in and out of everyone's talk, which is nice to see. There's a few favourites in there. It was kind of nice to see Gary's take on the holobionts, something that I've also been learning a lot about and realising its benefits. So that was quite nice to hear that. But basically, yeah, thank you very much to everyone for taking your time to put this presentation together, because it's never simple to record yourself, and it's always a bit cringeworthy as well. So thanks all. In the background, we've had some fantastic questions posed by our audience. I was kind of fearing that we might have to create a few ourselves, but actually it's been a plethora of questions posed, and thanks to some of the panel for responding to them. It's great to have some responses where possible. So thank you for that. But now I wanted to move on to the next bit of this discussion, and that's to actually have a chat about some of the key questions relevant, really. So basically, to the panel, I'm going to pose the first question, which is a bit of a more generic one now. Are these challenges still relevant, and are there new ones that need to be considered? I just think that the world has changed a lot since 2019 in a way that we possibly didn't think it would. And this paper was actually written back in 2018, 2017, so it's a long time. So what do the panel think of this? Go on, Gary, hand up first.
Oh, I think it set the scene really nicely, and you know, we are moving from where you set the scene to a new place, and I think we're still moving. It's not that old. I mean, you guys worked on it at what, 2016 it started? I can't remember, sometime about that. For me, it's been a journey from just doing pure science to actually getting into the socio-ecological aspects of the work I do, and getting into Indigenous communities and sitting with them and talking with them about their country, living on country, being responsible for country, not owning it, but being responsible for country. And in sea country, Indigenous communities, what they're seeing every day in their environment makes them cringe. And I think Jillian touched on this really nicely. We got to keep our eye on the ball in terms of the selfishness of development that make a few people very rich and most everybody else really not. And that's all social. It's got really, you know, we've got great scientists around the table here, but I would say that all of us keep looking at the social aspect as being a very important thing. A socio-economic, ecological model is something that we have to build for seagrass systems globally. I'll leave it at that. Let somebody else talk.
Yes, Maricela.
Thank you, Rich. I will take this opportunity because this is a wonderful day, and I am so happy to be here. And I think really that seagrasses deserve this, and we need to work more. And about your specific question, I definitely think that these challenges are absolutely relevant. But we, as you said, we have to consider that the world has changed so much, especially during the last 2 years, I would say, and that we have to start thinking more globally. I mean, of course, the local scale is extremely relevant, but we have to keep in mind all the time coming up to global scale. We have all these financial problems, we have all these security problems, we have climate change, not the last, and we have artificial intelligence, and this is driving me crazy. But I think that we can try to use the positive things that we can achieve with these new tools that are coming. And for seagrasses, there is a lot to do. The nice thing about seagrasses is that the community is still relatively small, and I have always felt that it's a very positive and working forward community. So that is a very strong part of the seagrass science, I would say. Yep.
Yes, Jess, go on.
I definitely like the point about being more global. I think that's the focus on that is happening about being not only thinking more globally, but being more willing to share our data or our ideas or opportunities with folks and increasing partnerships. No longer sort of coming in and posing our research on someone else's area, but finding local contacts and really learning from their expertise of the area. And I do think another area that I've witnessed personally is sort of this call for action. So no longer sort of waiting for kind of keep doing what we've done to kind of figure out the science for things like restoration, for example, but how can we be more proactive and try to not only restore for our current conditions, but how they were projected to be in the future. And so some previous ideas about, again, like things like moving plants and seeds along a geographic distribution outside of even between states, for example, in the United States, that's something that we hadn't really thought about in the past. And there's still a lot of ethical issues about it that we're still considering, but the conversations are happening now. And the whole idea is that if we can identify some of those traits, for example, in seagrasses that are resilient to heat stress or heat and low light stress, can we use that in a way to help project meadows that are not currently threatened, but will be in the future? And so there's a lot of more sort of out of the box thinking that I've noticed in the last couple of years.
Thanks, Jeffy. Just wanted to pose the next question and sort of point it towards Carmen, Jillian, and Len to add in here. It sort of follows on a bit from what you guys are saying, but it's I guess that there's been a lot of movement in terms of highlighting the importance of seagrass, and as a community we're doing a much better job than we ever were. But how can we now take the next step to someone put it, to really move the needle on seagrass conservation, going from awareness to actually action that makes real on the ground change? Go on, Jillian.
Okay. Well, I think to move the needle on that and to activate action, I guess there are two ways we could go about doing it, depending on the socio-cultural setting of where we are located. In some cases, top-down action is actually something that we need like straight away, because seagrasses are in such big trouble that sometimes grassroots action, it's just not fast enough. So I think we need to work on policymakers. I think that how we communicate as scientists is really important in how, we need to have like a 3-minute pitch in our pocket, so that when we come across a politician, like it all comes out and in a very compelling way, like with no graphs and no numbers, no maths, but something that just really catches them. So I think that the language we use to speak to policymakers has to change. We've got to make them really be aware of seagrasses in beyond just telling people to take action on the ground. But in other settings, I think grassroots action is still very important, and we still need to keep working on that. I really like what Carmen was saying when she said like the arts. Oh, I love that, and I hope Carmen will say more about that as well, because I really believe that the arts helps people to feel. So their response to seagrass is something that comes from the heart, not so much from the head and science, but like they feel, oh, I want to make a difference, and I'll go out there and start looking at seagrass today. So yeah, that's it.
Go, Carmen.
Yeah, I also think that we need more people, I mean, not just researchers, as the ones that are responsible to fight for seagrass conservation, because as we said, this is everyone is responsible for that. And sometimes what I feel is that we have all that responsibility. We are scientists, we cannot forget that. And we need like a more specialized workforce for communicate our research and to be involved in all these programs to raise awareness. So we need somehow to share that responsibility and have people that are trained to do that effectively. Because sometimes we try to do our best, but we are not maybe the best communicators. So we really need to train and to work on that workforce.
Thank you, Carmen. A question that I think I'll start off by pointing towards Len, as probably a more appropriate person in the group. Is there a single international accessible database of seagrass mapping and restoration insights and activity? If not, are there aspirations to have one, or would such a curated and open source resource be valuable, given it could be funded?
Good question. I mean, and I suppose the most basic answer is no, there isn't such a database that exists. We have some which are, particularly in terms of the mapping side, we have some repositories where there is some information, but you know, one of the things we sadly still lack, and one of these challenges we still have is, you know, what actually is the extent of the resource we're dealing with, and you know, what is the condition of that resource, and it's highly variable. And you know, the good thing is, and I think we still have the same challenges that we had and we proposed back in 2017 when we had these discussions, but there's been some major improvements in the last 5 years. I mean, particularly when we look at things like mapping and the technologies that we now use. There's been really significant improved Earth observing platforms which are now available. So people can use UAVs, there's high resolution remote sensing. We've got improved approaches for dealing with the data, like the temporal data stacking and the random forest work that we're all getting involved with. So these new technologies like deep learning, they're improving the quality of our maps, particularly our understanding of what a map is. I mean, when most people look at seagrass maps, you're just going to see a big polygon, you're going to see a big blob. But the reality is what's in that blob can be spatially and in terms of its condition very different. So you can have a very fragmented meadow, which can, when it starts to fragment, it's going to start to lose the goods and benefits it provides. And trying to identify seagrass habitats amongst the complex habitats in which they live, identifying them, separating them from rock and coral and everything else. That's a challenge we have, but there are better ways we're starting to deal with that. So, you know, the good thing in the last 5 years and what we're really in, I suppose, at the moment is a big period of change, particularly for how we do a lot of our data collection. So it's an opportune time for us to really look carefully at standardization. So if we are going to start collecting this mapping and collecting maps in the future, we can do it more accurately, more efficiently, that we can also be very honest and transparent about the confidence that that data has been collected, because all that makes a big difference to how we put that data together at a global scale. And people can play different roles in this as well. So yes, you'll have remote sensors who'll be looking, you know, those people with expertise will be looking at very large scale, but no matter what data you collect using Earth observing systems, you have to have the field validation. So once again, we still need people to get out there and validate what we're seeing. So when you see something dark in an image, is it seagrass? Is it coral? Is it rock? You know, we need that information. And a key way we can do that is using things like Seagrass Spotter. This is where anybody can contribute. It's very easy to use, but people don't seem to understand for such a simple thing to do to capture a geotagged image, how important that is when we're trying to validate imagery. So the more people embrace that, the better quality our data can be. And then we can start pulling that data together into these bigger collected and network systems. So, so we will be able to say, a bit like the mangrove people do every year, mangroves, they can tell you exactly how much mangroves there are in the world. We're dealing with a seagrass which is growing in optically complex habitats and optically complex waters where it's not so easy. So, I believe we'll get there one day. And, how we deal with the mapping images and how we can standardize the variables and what we collect in the field. So those ocean observing variables, those essential ocean variables, I mean, once those sort of things become standardized, I think we're going to see in the next, 3 to 5 years, or at least by the end of this decade, we're going to have some really good databases on which we can we'll have that evidence on which we can make some really good. And we'll actually know what is the condition of our seagrasses globally. Where do we need to focus the efforts to restore? Where do we need to continue to do the right things? And to be honest, some of the places where the right things are happening is where people are more closely connected to seagrass environments. These, if you work across the Pacific Islands, their seagrasses, they're actually doing pretty well because people have a close cultural connection. Their livelihoods, their well-being is dependent on those seagrasses. So they take better care of them than what we do when we come in and build all our industries along the coast. So I think there's a lot of promise in the years ahead. The challenges are still there. And we need to work better as a community. The resources will be there for us to share our data better. So we can, in those big databases, so we can make more confident decisions about how things are.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with all of that. It's a big challenge. I can't ignore the fact that there's many questions in the Q&A about carbon, and I think something that gets ignored in this space is the potential emissions that seagrass may have from a methane and a nitrous oxide perspective. And there's a question raised about that I think it's important to recognise. And I don't know who wants to answer this, but basically, what are we doing as a community to understand the more awkward and difficult element of the carbon balance in seagrass? Does any brave one of you want to answer that question? Go on. I'm sure that was almost a hand, Gary.
It's almost a hand. My suggestion is go talk to Jim Forkrian at Florida International University. Jim's a biogeochemist, and his discussion around this is that seagrasses, especially in carbonate systems, are net exporters, contemporary exporters of CO2 at large amounts. And recently he's done a whole series of ocean atmosphere, the seawater levels to show that very, very clearly for Florida Bay. But Jim is also a big blue carbon advocate, because blue carbon is that is organic, that is buried in the sediments. And I talked a bit about sulfur dynamics, but what I didn't say was anoxia in sediments allows for the persistence of organic carbon such that it becomes millennial when you bury it. So Shark Bay is 8,000 years old. Before that, it was land. And over a series of inundations and re-emergences, it has created 8,000 years of buried carbon in the system. So, and that's about 7.5 meters deep. So if you look at that, the volume of carbon at between 5 and 7% in the system buried in that sediment is excessive. When we had the heat wave, as I'm going to forget her name. This is Arias Ortiz, did this work. We found that between 9 and 27% of the annual production of carbon in terrestrial Australia was released from that 2011 heat wave. The reason to conserve seagrass is to conserve the buried carbon that's trapped in the sediments. It's not really the production of leaf that produces the carbon that's buried. So you've got this sort of conflicting, sort of contemporary many systems of net carbon exporters, but seagrasses themselves, if not disturbed and if allowed to shallow the shallow waters, actually bury significant amounts in gigatons of sediment. That's my view.
Oh, thank you. I don't want to run over too much, but I just wanted to finish with one final question, really, posed to you all to very quickly answer. Is where in the world are we seeing real hope in the conservation of seagrass? Where are the beacons of hope?
I think we should ask Len, who has a great view of the Indo-West Pacific, to give us a view of that region, and then we just walk around the room and ask.
Thanks, Gary. Well, I honestly do think that the Pacific, it really is one of those areas of hope. It is a bright spot in terms of, it has low human impact or threats from human activity. It is relatively low. People are very closely connected to seagrass. So they actually have been for millennia taking care of seagrass. So it's when we start to get to our more developed countries, it becomes a problem. So the Pacific is, I think, one of our hope spots. I'd also like to think there are parts of Africa. I mean, certainly what we're seeing in parts of West Africa, where there's been some recent mapping exercises, and even parts of the East Africa. I think there are some areas there which are also some hope spots too.
Go on, Jesse, you were about to answer before Gary stopped Lennon.
I would say that, in addition to some potential actual physical locations, the beacons of hope to me are the seagrass community and the way that we're approaching this now and the new directions that we're taking it. The inclusion of lots of different social sciences and learning more from the communities where the seagrasses have been. I feel like that's, and being willing to be a little more aggressive when it comes to conservation and restoration and protections. I think that to me is a really positive sign. So in addition to location, the community is expanding and we're doing it though in smart ways, I think. So that's good.
Thank you. Is there any other additions to that from Carmen or Jillian or Maricela? Go on.
Okay, no, I do agree with Len that some parts of East Africa are taking this very seriously, and the organizations working there as well. And then I maybe can take the example here in Sweden. There has been a lot of money for seagrass research and seagrass restoration, and that's very good because here is the same as any other place. They are not very recognized. So this is hopeful from a developed country perspective.
Yes, it's the same here in Portugal. We lost many seagrasses, but there are still areas that are in good shape, and I think it's important to try to protect them and also to restore what we lost. But I would say that even in Europe, there are still areas in which we can find healthy seagrass meadows.
Here in Malaysia, I would say the beacons of hope for seagrass isn't actually in really undisturbed areas, but it's at the areas that are on the brink of destruction. Areas where local communities and NGOs still continue to fight the good fight. They still stand out there and try to protect their plot of seagrass. And I'd like to give a shout out to Serena Rahman with working with the youth of Club Alami, actually, in the southern part of Peninsular Malaysia, which is an area that I always usually go to. It has one of the largest intertidal meadows that is really under heavy threat from coastal development. But the community there, the fisher folk, with the NGO that works there on seagrass, they just band together to stand up for seagrass conservation. And hats off to them, actually. There's not been a lot of shout outs for them, but they just continue standing up. To me, they are an inspirational beacon of hope.
Thank you. I think that's a nice place to end this webinar, really. I think, and it just reflects the massive efforts that people all around the world are taking to conserve, to understand, and to ultimately protect the long-term seagrasses. So I just want to thank you as panelists for the effort put into it, and also thanks for the over 200 attendees today who've come and listened and spent whatever time of day it is in their part of the world listening to watching these talks. So thank you very much, and hopefully this is a start of a longer term thing with World Seagrass Day, pushing forward the conservation of this amazing habitat. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rich, for organizing.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Cheers, guys. And I'll let various of you go to get some sleep, and those get their day on the go. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Rich.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.